Thanks for downloading the McKay interview. This podcast is brought to you by Kyoto Japan Automotive Group, a company which I've known personally for over 20 years, and your one-stop shop for tires, batteries, and auto parts. Visit their website at www.kyotojap.com for more details. My newest guest is Kinza Win. She's a seasoned and independent advisor on philanthropy at both the giving and the receiving ends, with long experience in the financial services and wealth management industry. We discuss many aspects, including the motivations for philanthropy, aid and commercial philanthropy, and the implications and consequences of states and large corporations engaging in the act of giving. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Hello, everyone. At these times of great need and great wealth, where the gap is widening between those who have and those who have much, much less, I turn my thoughts to philanthropy and what it means today. Now, here in Switzerland, we know of many prominent foundations which give and give generously. Wilsdorf, Oak, Aga Khan, Baylor, Avena are all prominent Swiss names, and there are many more. Globally, we all know of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and we see the good effects of their money here in Geneva. For example, Gavi and the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria. It's a huge business today and certainly has moved far away from its basic underpinnings in, for example, the New Testament, when I think of the parable of the Good Samaritan in St. Luke's Gospel, and Zakat, the alms tax levied to benefit the poor and the needy, which is the duty of all Muslims and is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. But has the water of goodness been muddied by corporate and even state interests? Is it even fair to put in the same basket of debate countries with questionable human rights records buying their way, and I stress through quite legitimate use of the free market, into sports clubs and international sporting events in order to present a better face to the wider public? Or am I conflating and confusing two quite different activities? Now, there are different ways in which I could have approached today's subject, but in the end I came down on the side of inviting someone I know who's an expert with practical experience in the corporate and international financial world and now advises parties on both sides of the giving-receiving equation. It's my hope that she can give me and all of us a balanced and dispassionate view of modern-day philanthropy, of giving in the first quarter of the 21st century. Kinza Win is based in Geneva, and we're in the friendly Hotel Warwick, which is also in Geneva. And I'm going to ask her to introduce herself before we start our conversation. Hello, Kinza. Welcome to the McKay interview, and thanks for making time for me and our listeners. Kinza.
Well, hello, Michael, and thank you so much for both taking the time and dedicating the time to your listeners to the topic of philanthropy.
It's my pleasure, and it's something which I'm very keen to know a little bit more about, because it's a name and it's a word that we hear so often, and yet, like a lot of things in life, it's like an iceberg. What's above the water, it disguises what's in fact below the waterline. Now, we've known each other for quite a few years, but for the benefit of our listeners, please tell me a little bit about yourself and your activities in the field of philanthropy.
Well, a few decades ago, there wasn't really a professional field of philanthropy. So I, as many of my generation, the 50 plus, if you like, really came to that at a later stage in life. I began, and I think it's important to note that because you have a very diverse background and viewpoints of people coming into the profession from this generation. I started and worked over 20 plus years in banking as a private banker, which I'm sure you're
So you're a private banker, or you were a private banker?
Once upon a time, yes.
Okay.
And I think your Swiss audience would know what that means.
Yes.
Working really in the area of wealth management. And I transitioned in 2013, where I decided to open, I asked the management, got their support to open philanthropy department within the bank. And then in 2016, I also joined Lombard Odier, also working in the context of a bank in philanthropy. At the time, we had met when I was in Barclays, the first the first bank I started Philanthropy in, then I went to Lombard-Odier, and finally in 2019 decided to become independent and created Win Advisors. So have been independent since that day. And today I advise private philanthropists on how to set up their philanthropy and operate it and all that they need to understand and take care for. I also advise wealth intermediaries, a domain that I covered professionally, on how to help their clients start a philanthropy and what to think about and how to structure it. And on the other side, I also work with NGOs, helping them because they've historically been mostly exposed to institutional and government funding, how to collaborate and work with the private sector.
Okay, so there are literally two sides to the equation, and you've come from an excellent background in the financial services business. Now, I know it sounds very boring to ask you to define and give me and the listeners a simple definition, but tell us how you would define philanthropy and how big that philanthropy business is as best as it can be defined.
Well, one always goes back to the original. It's quite challenging because it's changed so much. But the original definition of philanthropy that many are probably aware of is the word philos, phil, loving, and anthrop, mankind. And I think we need to go back to those origins because as things transition, we forget what it was all about at some point in time. So it's really the love of mankind and the altruism and the hope. It's more a movement and a concept than an actual, definition. So the love of mankind, and as we've come to recognize, we share and we owe our well-being to the environment, to the nature, to the plants, and to the world in which we live. So today, really, it's altruism towards both the human needs, health, culture, education, human rights, peace building, as well as the planet as a whole and all the ecosystems that, and be it the climate, the wildlife, and all these areas of key concern.
And I wanted to ask you if you think that's a very pure and good definition. No one would argue with that, but are people able to hold to those values from those former times and in the etymology of the word itself? What do you think?
Well, I think we need to constantly remind ourselves what philanthropy is to make sure that we do hold to them, as much as possible. Of course, the bigger the, as you called it, the market or the business becomes, there's always, mission drift and we deviate from that. But I think we need to return to those core values. When you ask me the size of the market, we are talking about 200 billion if we take the 2021 numbers of philanthropy giving. If we add back the non-profit sector and the charitable sector, we're talking about 320 billion, with people saying it will reach 500 billion by 2030. So this has become huge. And of course, by its very scale, it involves far more stakeholders than we can even imagine sometimes.
It sounds like a lot of money.
Indeed.
Yeah. just as you paint the map for me, just tell me, who are the prominent names? I mentioned a few at the beginning, but there must be countless more. And do they fall easily into easily definable categories, Kinza?
So yes, you mentioned some of the names, and I think just to give you a notion of the biggest names out there, sometimes we haven't necessarily heard of. I think the number one, would be the Novo Nordisk Foundation, which is based in Denmark, and they have focused on medical treatment. So you can see that big foundations tend to focus on work on one area simply because by the sheer size and the institutional type of funding that they provide. The one you mentioned was the Gates Foundation, the one probably we've most heard of, with around $50 billion as well, also with the contributions of Warren Buffett, which feeds into the foundation. They would be as number three, if you like.
Could I just stop you there, Kinza? Because when we were talking before we turned the microphones on, you used that expression, which I didn't really follow it, which feeds into, this from Warren Buffett. What is that? What do you mean by that, it feeds into?
Well, I mean, they were seeing more and more that, large foundations, large contributors are partnering, are working together.
I see.
And I think that's, one of the trends that I think is very beneficial in that it's not about one's personal ego or personal mission, it's about achieving a goal and working together to achieve that goal.
So you see that as a good thing?
Definitely,
yeah,
definitely.
I see. I didn't quite follow that. Okay. So just tell me, and this may again sound like a rather odd question, but it fascinates me because I'm not in any way associated with that business. But describe for me, in your experience, and your experience has been quite long in this area, the different motivations to give.
So yes, well, they definitely it's there's a variety of sources of motivation. So, altruism takes different forms. On the private level, you have often a family with a story and causes they support and they feel strongly about. So from that perspective, they would like to, support these specific causes, as a group. But, as Winston Churchill so beautifully said, we make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give. And many who have been very fortunate and made a lot of money during their lifetime feel deeply indebted to society and wish to simply redistribute some of this wealth to those who have been less fortunate.
And you've met people like that. I mean, they really do feel that sincerely, do they?
Oh, they do.
Some of them.
They do.
Yeah.
Well, some feel that very sincerely and throughout their lifetime have redistributed. But, having more time at a certain point when they've built their career, they feel the need to share and to redistribute, if only to... to thank, to be out of gratitude for where they've come, and also out of a deep understanding that there is a huge divide in wealth, and it is also their responsibility to help breach this divide. And then they have their views and things they would like to leave as a legacy. Simply.
It was very encouraging for you to hear you say that. My guest today is Kinza Win, founder of Win Advisors, and we're talking about philanthropy, a subject about which he's very knowledgeable and one which plays a significant part in the lives of many of us around the world. Now, Kinza, how would you describe the difference, or the differences, between private and institutional giving and even state giving, namely from governments to international organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross, as we're in the city that's the home of the Red Cross? Explain how that works and these differences, because I don't understand it.
Well, I think one of the big challenges today is that all these differences, these initial differences are being blurred by the very nature of the private giving that's come into play. As you heard, a lot of this funding is institutional in size. So the sheer size of the giving makes that between a government and an individual, that, if we just take the example, for example, of the Gates Foundation, it comes as the second biggest funder of the World Health Organization, directly behind its own government, but before all the other governments that ensue. So to what extent, it definitely plays a role and has the influence equivalent to the government.
So let me stop you there. You're saying to me and the listeners that the Gates Foundation is number 2 after the United States government in terms of its donations.
Indeed.
Good grief.
So this is where one comes to say where the lines are blurred. When private funding is in excess of government or institutional, funding, where do the differences lie, and where do the differences, of approach and influence lies, becomes a whole question in itself.
And I guess they need advisors to help them walk that line, because it cannot be easy with the politics and all the financial risks involved.
Well, advisors, these very big institutions have their own agenda and own priorities. They obviously are there to support, but as you mentioned before, they do try to specialize themselves in a domain because their area of influence is so great. So in terms of, I think what's important to note is more, and I think important for our audience to realize, is that these are huge funders. But going back to what philanthropy means, I think we also need to remember that philanthropy is civil society, lots of millions of private individuals who over history have also contributed. Individuals contribute at a personal level, helping their neighbor. It need not be money, it need not be billions, it need not be millions. It's the private altruism that we constitute as a human group towards others. And this, has more impact. We must think of also as philanthropy as impact, not funding. So it's the money definitely is a tool to achieve the impact, but the goal is to achieve a philanthropic impact. And if we don't lose this, I think it's important to keep this in mind, because this is what will make us, understand it and not lose, the mission at heart, is to understand at all times this impact.
And from what you say and the look on your face as I look across you, that there clearly is a danger that this can be lost sight of.
Yes, the large sums of money do have a lot of influence, but it's always been individuals and civil society that have played an immense role throughout history in making sure that the voice was heard of what was needed. It didn't become a political agenda or an institutional agenda. The agenda is the nature and the human beings that surround us, and they should have at all times a voice, and it should be their voice that is heard above, in and above all others.
So you brought the conversation round quite neatly, Kinza, to a question which I really wanted to ask you, which is drawing a line between aid and commercial philanthropy. Forgive me if the adjective commercial philanthropy is a bit jarring, but it's the one I've chosen. It must present problems. And I'm thinking, for example, in the recent earthquake in Turkey and the amount of money that's flown, it's been given, the war in Ukraine, the migrant crisis across the Mediterranean, which has been going on for a long time. So again, give me some sort of help, guide me through what must be quite a complex field where you have this aid rubbing shoulders with philanthropy.
Well, I'm very happy you mentioned these examples, because I think they do exemplify the concerns and the nature of philanthropy today. When we think of these are all present in people's minds. The earthquake in Turkey. Who were the first responders? They were not governments. They were not big philanthropies. They were people that were living close by and had been less hit. And who was digging through the rubble? It was literally other small communities that came together and helped their fellow compatriots, and this was very much the case also with the war in Ukraine. Who were the first out there, waiting at the border with food, with clothes, with toiletries, and it was other people, living close to the border, or people that went around in schools and got all the utilities they could and came to the border. Then only organizations came behind and structured, and in some cases one could even say that what the governments and the institutions did was helped and sometimes even hindered. If we look what happened with the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean, the first thing that comes to mind is those boats with migrants in it, and organizations like MSF, Doctors Without Borders, who would go with the boats and on board the migrants off their rafts, and then ask for to be able to dock their boat in the nearest country and be refused to come to port, with people literally, dying, out at sea. Of course, these organizations, did what they were about, their role was to do, save these people. And when they came to dock, there was nothing that could be done except, the country, according to international laws, needed to take them in. But the boats were then quarantined, and the MSF staff were literally imprisoned like criminals.
Well, there's been quite a bit of controversy about this in some countries in Italy.
Yeah, yes, the whole migrant crisis, I think, is one big controversial and relatively, this is personal, but shameful kind of approach that we have taken to dealing with, the specific crisis. But this is where we see that, civil society and different organizations take a different approach. If I just take that example of MSF, we need to understand that
Médecins Sans Frontières,
Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders in English. We need to understand that some organizations receive government funding and some do not. If in the example of the ICRC, for example, International Red Cross, they receive government funding, which makes that when they, in certain, critical humanitarian missions where they'd like to be involved, for political reasons, they cannot always, be present. Whilst Médecins Sans Frontières has always refused government aid, with the result that they have the freedom to operate apolitically wherever they go. Now, that comes at a huge cost for an organization because government funding is one of the biggest funders out there. When you have to go to institutional or private funding, it's a lot more difficult, a lot more work. We're talking about smaller amounts. But it's the sacrifice that they make and the choice that they make more than sacrifice in order to be really be able to indiscriminately help all populations. And we need to understand that these organizations make these choices to be as equalitarian as possible in the help they provide. But these organizations also need private help. When private donors give, they need to be aware that it's not a level playing field. And some organizations, by not taking government help, need desperately private donors to come and fill that in. And that's something that's really, not known. And private donors have that flexibility to go where others can't, where at a political level or otherwise. So I think this is, important to note.
No, your point is well made and well taken, but I want you, just without running the risk of being indiscreet, and I'm sure having been a private banker, you wouldn't be indiscreet, but give us some insights, because most of us listening are not that close to your field. Give us some insights into the hidden dangers, the tripwires, the minefields in the commercial aspects of philanthropy. And when you're advising clients, what do you tell them to watch out for and be careful of?
Oh, well, I think that the fact that philanthropy's become more and more diverse and complex, it's raised a lot of challenges because there's a lot of forces at play. Other than tripwires and minefields, I think it's really a question of anything, like in any field of complexity, there's a huge amount of knowledge to be acquired in order to do something well. And that knowledge needs to be acquired. One can't base on assumption. The field is definitely professionalized, but it's become extremely complex. I'll just give you an example. One would assume a foundation, has a charitable role. In Switzerland, foundations as legal structures are used more and more, for example, by crypto organizations out there, and have nothing charitable or about them. So we assume that when we see the word foundation, it's a charity. It's not necessarily the case. This legal structure is used in other contexts, and then we also tend to look at organizations which we see a lot in the press or do a lot of marketing and communication, but a lot of the organizations having the greatest impact are those that focus on their goals, that every penny goes to their objectives. And so we simply don't hear about them. So we need to be able to identify in this big sea of philanthropy, who is having impact, who are the small organizations that are not being seen and being helped, but that are doing their work in an amazing way. Not everybody can afford huge budgets for marketing and communication, and that is actually a good thing. But they also these voices need to be heard.
And these structures you talk about, there's a tax benefit clearly within the way some jurisdictions organize these, what's available to foundations and companies that set up these structures. Is that not the case?
So definitely, there's always kind of intelligent way of structuring, philanthropy when, in the big endowments in the US, I mean, it's always been very kind of criticized that a lot of money is put in the endowment and not, less is paid out, and there's a huge tax benefit in doing so. I mean, a foundation in Switzerland, there also is a tax benefit in doing so, and they are, sometimes, used, I wouldn't say purely for the tax benefit, but I mean, there's also a whole legal environment around that where it has to be for public good for them to be a tax benefit. So there's a whole legality around it, but there is an element of, incentivization through taxation, which I think, is beneficial at the onset because as any government, they're encouraging private donors to contribute.
Okay. We're coming to the end of our time, Kinza, but again, I'm puzzled because I see these things so clearly in front of me on the television, in the radio, in the newspapers, and I'm interested to hear what you as a professional would say are the differences between philanthropy and sponsorship.
Oh, well, so, yes, I mean, the
you
lines
laugh
would be...
when you say that, but
yes,
tell me what you're thinking.
Well, ultimately, everybody's kind of exchanging money, for some
benefit.
For some benefit. I think the big difference being that sponsorship is who the benefit is for. So, philanthropy, the benefit will be altruistically for those in need, or, a cause that needs to be defended. And sponsorship is often money exchanged, and the cause is that of the sponsor. So,
And your thoughts on businesses and now even states? I mean, one thinks of Qatar and Saudi Arabia buying football clubs, major sports events, and I realize that such actions are not essentially philanthropic, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on such actions, because it seems to me that the complexion of this goodness is changing in front of our very eyes these days.
Well, philanthropy is being a word that's being more common practice and used a little bit in all different contexts. But that's why I always go back to the definition of being altruistic and achieving the good of those in need, or the environment, or nature. Because if one tries to remember who's the beneficiary is and what the impact is being achieved, one can quickly identify what's true philanthropy or not. But that being said, there's been so much. It's been very politicized, as everything today. I think philanthropy hasn't escaped that trend, and sadly, it's a part of it. But just to talk about Qatar and Saudi Arabia, they have historically always supported humanitarian aid and assistance and social development throughout the Middle East. Yeah. That's part of as you mentioned before, zakat. So communities have supported their own communities, and continue to do so. But the very attraction of the word, the money, the trend, will, invariably, make people overuse the word philanthropy. But if one thinks that even if it's overused and ultimately some beneficiaries that need it are having the positive impact, one needs to discern really the impact it's having, because sometimes it's maybe leveraged, let's say, but populations in need are getting the benefit. Then I think we need to leave a little bit of leeway to so that if someone can get some publicity out of it, why not? If we are helping the cause that needs to be helped.
Kinza, last question. With your long experience, do you detect a trend in the direction that philanthropy is moving? And as a corollary to that, are funds directed at giving increasing or decreasing?
So, I definitely think funds are increasing, to go to your second part of the question first. But the trends other than, the big divide getting bigger and bigger between those who need and those who have, I think the trend today, because of the complexity, is to move towards far more strategic and collaborative philanthropy. One can't just walk into an African village and say, well, I'd like to build a school there and help. There are, most often other organizations there. We don't see the full picture, and other things are being done, and people are not necessarily making use of funds and resources in the best way. So philanthropy has really organized itself far more strategically, and whether one's a small donor or a bigger donor, to be part and have an understanding of this landscape strategically, and to work collaboratively both with other individuals and organizations is really key to having an impact and an understanding of the environment in which one works. It's also critical for people to understand that it's become far more professionalized. So donors, there's a certain level of education and understanding that needs to be acquired. And that's, my role is to really educate people around what they want to achieve and what the impact of that, but also help people understand that it's, there's a perception and then there's a reality, and make sure that they're aligned. And then there's always a reality check. We see billions doing certain things and millions doing others, and we want to encourage every level of donation, even if someone wants to just give 1,000 francs towards something. But we have to realize that proportional and the type of giving, whether it's regular or irregular, all have an impact on and a responsibility with the people we're looking, or the causes we're looking to support. So all of that is really educational. I also think that part of the trend is that the next generation are becoming far more involved. So educating them is also, I think, a huge responsibility for the philanthropy community. We can see the University of Geneva has opened a department of philanthropy.
Really?
So it's become, a little bit more, it's mainstream academic, which is wonderful, because I think that we need philanthropy. Philanthropy is definitely a part of the pictures. Governments can't support the needs. They have other needs, and the world is changing in that respect. And each one's individual responsibility and collective responsibility is something that should be built into the education system and organized accordingly.
Thank you.
A way of
It's absolutely fascinating lesson in philanthropy and giving, and I've certainly learned a lot over the last 30 minutes. My guest today has been Kinza Win, founder of Win Advisors, and we've been talking about philanthropy and giving. Thank you again, Kinza.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm so glad to be able to share some information, and hopefully there'll be more and more philanthropists to support the different causes.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to the McKay Interview podcast, brought to you by Kyoto Japan Automotive Group, a company which I've known personally for over 20 years, and your one-stop shop for tyres, batteries and auto parts. Visit their website at www.kyotojap.com for more details. And you can find more podcasts on Anchor FM. Just Google McKay Interview Anchor FM. Thanks again for listening.